The sun was low, stretching long shadows across the dusty land, and the air carried that dry silence that only the American frontier seemed to know. The plains rolled out wide and endless, broken only by the jagged rise of distant cliffs and the faint outline of a river cutting through the wilderness. It was the kind of land that made a person feel both small and unshakably alive. But for one woman stumbling along that rough trail, there was no beauty in the sight. Her world had turned into pain and dust. She had fallen hard, her dress torn at the seams, her palms scraped raw against the rocky ground. Each breath burned her lungs as if the earth itself had turned against her. She had been beaten, yes, but worse than the blows was the humiliation, the laughter that had chased her into the dirt, the way her spirit felt crushed beneath cruel hands and harsher words. She tried to rise, but her legs betrayed her. They trembled beneath her weight, and she sank once more onto the ground, her hair clinging to her tear-streaked face. The silence now was heavy, pressing down on her as if the whole wilderness had turned its gaze upon her weakness. She wanted to scream, to curse the world, but her voice was broken into sobs that carried no strength. For the first time in her life, she felt entirely alone, a fragile figure abandoned in a place that cared nothing for her suffering. Yet the land had its guardians, one she did not expect. From the shadows at the edge of the trail, a figure appeared, moving with a quietness that seemed almost unreal. He was tall, his body strong and lean, his long black hair falling against his shoulders, catching the last light of the setting sun. His chest was bare, marked with the strength of someone who had lived closer to the earth than most could imagine. Around his neck hung pieces of tribal jewelry, tokens of his people, carrying stories she could not yet understand. His eyes, dark as the river at midnight, fixed upon her. There was no laughter in them, no cruelty, only an intensity that silenced her fear for a fleeting moment. The woman's breath caught in her throat as he stepped closer. The world had taught her to fear his kind. The stories whispered in town spoke of raids, of fires in the night, of warriors who showed no mercy. Yet standing before her now, the Apache carried something entirely different. He crouched down without a word, his movements careful, almost reverent, as if afraid she might break if he touched her. When his hands slid beneath her arms to lift her up, she braced for pain. Instead, she found herself steadied, raised from the dirt with a gentleness she had never known. The strength in his arms was undeniable, but it was not a strength used to harm. It was the strength of someone who had chosen to protect, though she could not understand why. She looked at him through her blurred vision, struggling to speak, but her voice failed her again. He seemed to understand without words, and for the first time since she had fallen, she no longer felt alone. The silence between them was broken only by the soft rustle of the wind in the grass. His voice came at last, low and firm, carrying the weight of an oath that could not be easily broken. He told her she would not be harmed again, that no hand would be raised against her so long as he stood near. It was a promise given simply, yet it struck through her heart with a power greater than any vow she had ever heard. She could see it in his eyes. This was not a man who spoke lightly. To him, a promise was as binding as blood. She wanted to ask why. Why would an Apache warrior, feared by so many, choose to lift up a stranger beaten and humiliated? Why would he care for a woman who had no place in his world, who likely came from the very people who mistrusted his kind? But the words tangled in her throat, and the question stayed unspoken. Instead, she let herself lean against him, her body trembling, her heart torn between fear and fragile hope. The sky deepened above them, turning to hues of red and violet as night pressed in. Somewhere in the distance, coyotes called, their cries sharp and haunting. The land seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for what would come next. She did not know where he intended to take her, whether toward safety or into the unknown. All she knew was that when his hand steadied her shoulder, she felt, for the first time in years, that she might not have to face the world alone. But protection came at a price. She sensed it in the way his gaze scanned the horizon and the tension that rippled through his frame. Whoever had struck her down had not been far behind. The cruelty she had suffered was not born of strangers, but of those who thought they owned her fate. They would not let her go easily. She realized, with a chill that cut through even the warmth of his presence, that his promise to protect her would soon be tested. The sound of distant hooves stirred the air, faint at first, then growing louder, carrying the weight of pursuit. Dust rose on the far edge of the trail, shapes moving fast, voices riding the wind. Her heart thudded against her ribs, panic flooding back with each beat. She clutched his arm, her eyes wide with fear, and he turned toward the sound, his jaw set with unspoken defiance. He had chosen to lift her up from the ground, to shield her from harm. Now, standing between her and the threat that closed in, he would have to prove that his promise was more than words. The woman could feel her breath hitch as she realized what was about to unfold. She was caught between two worlds, one that had broken her and one that had unexpectedly offered her safety. The Apache's grip tightened slightly on her arm, steadying her trembling frame as if to remind her she was no longer alone. The riders were coming closer, their shadows lengthening against the falling night. Every instinct told her to run, but her legs still wavered beneath her. She knew she could not outrun them. The warrior did not move, not yet. He stood tall, a silent figure carved against the twilight, his presence unshaken by the approaching storm. She did not know what would happen next, only that her fate was bound now to his. Her heart raced, torn between dread and the fragile spark of hope he had lit within her. The dust rose higher, the riders drew nearer, and as the last light of the sun disappeared beyond the cliffs, she realized the night would decide everything. The dust cloud grew heavier, each passing second pulling the threat closer, and though her body screamed to flee, the woman remained frozen at the Apache's side. The sound of hooves against the hardened trail rang sharp through the evening air, echoing like a drumbeat of danger. She clutched the warrior's arm without even realizing it, her nails digging into his skin, and still he stood unmoved. His dark eyes stayed fixed on the horizon, watching with the patience of someone who had weathered storms before. Her breath came fast, each one pulling through her chest like fire. She tried to steady herself, but memories of what had been done to her pressed down again, reminding her of the cruelty she had already endured. The humiliation still burned, and the thought of facing those men once more filled her with a terror she could not name. Yet there was also a spark, something unfamiliar but powerful, growing stronger with every heartbeat she spent beside the man who had lifted her from the dirt. The riders were not close enough to see faces yet, but she knew who they were. She had felt the sting of their fists, heard the cruel laughter that haunted her even now. They were men who took pride in breaking others, men who had once convinced her she was nothing more than a thing to be discarded. She had thought she would never escape them. And now, though she had found herself under the protection of someone stronger than she imagined, a new fear tugged at her. Could even he stop them? Could one man hold back the tide of violence that seemed to follow her? The Apache's hand shifted, steady but firm against her arm. He glanced down at her just once, and in that silent exchange she felt the weight of his vow again. He had not promised easily, nor would he abandon it now. Still, his silence left her unsettled. She longed to know what he was thinking, what plan he carried in his mind as the danger drew nearer. But he said nothing. His stillness was its own answer, as if the earth itself had rooted him in place. Night was falling fast. The last streaks of light slipped behind the cliffs, painting the world in shadow, and the riders' shapes grew clearer in the dim glow. She could hear their voices now, rough and careless, carrying laughter that struck her like blows. Her stomach twisted, her body trembling as she pressed closer to the warrior, though she hated to show her weakness. He did not turn her away. His presence was steady, grounding her even as fear threatened to unravel her. She could not stop her thoughts from wandering back to the life that had led her here. She had not been born for this land. She came from a place where the soil was tamed and fences marked every line, where rules were written and followed, but not always fair. She had been raised with lessons about obedience, about silence, about holding her head down even when her heart cried out for something more. That life had promised safety, but it had only ever delivered control. And when she had tried to step outside it, when she had tried to reach for freedom, she had been beaten back into place. The men chasing her now were not strangers. They were the shadows of that past, men who claimed to know her worth better than she did, men who had chosen cruelty over kindness because cruelty was easy. They had stripped her down, not just with blows but with words, until she no longer recognized herself. And when she had finally broken free, they had come after her, unwilling to let her go. She had thought escape impossible, but the land had led her to this moment, to the warrior who had chosen to lift her up when no one else had. Her heart swelled with questions she could not ask. Who was he, this man of the earth, who carried both strength and mercy in his hands? Why had he chosen her when he could have walked on and left her where she had fallen? There was mystery in him, something she could not yet name. His presence was a contradiction to all she had been taught, and the longer she stood beside him, the more she felt the truth she once believed begin to crumble. The riders were closer now. She could see the outlines of their hats, the curve of rifles strapped to their saddles, the glint of spurs at their boots. Her breath quickened again, and the terror clawed at her chest. The Apache shifted his stance, one hand tightening near the knife at his side, his posture calm but ready. He was one against many, and yet not a single trace of fear marked his face. She wondered if he had fought battles before, if he carried scars hidden beneath his skin. He looked unshaken, as if he had long accepted the dangers of life on this harsh land. The woman wanted to run, but she knew running would be useless. Her legs would give out, her body too weak to carry her far, and if she fell again, there would be no chance left. She pressed her lips together, trying to find strength in the silence, and let her gaze fall on the warrior once more. He had promised to protect her, and though her mind doubted, her heart clung to those words as if they were the only rope keeping her from the abyss. The riders slowed as they neared, dust swirling around their horses. Their voices grew louder, sharper, filled with arrogance. One called out, his tone mocking, but the words stung too deeply to repeat in her mind. The sound of it cut through her like a knife, dragging her back to the dirt where she had first fallen. Shame burned in her, and for a moment she wanted to sink back into herself, to disappear. But the Apache's hand did not release her. He kept her standing tall, as if to remind her that she was no longer alone, no longer helpless. The air between the two groups thickened with tension. The riders laughed again, their tone edged with threat, and her body stiffened in fear. She waited for the warrior to speak, but he remained silent, his gaze unwavering, his presence steady as stone. The men taunted, circling their words like vultures, but he did not falter. His silence was not weakness but defiance, a power that seemed to unsettle even those who had come chasing. The woman's heart raced faster, each moment stretching like a lifetime. She did not know how this would end, whether blood would be spilled on the dirt before them, or if some miracle would carry them out of danger. The mystery of the warrior deepened with every breath. She longed to understand him, to know the story written in his eyes, but there was no time for questions now. Only the pounding of hooves, the biting laughter of men who sought to reclaim her, and the quiet, unshaken resolve of the Apache who had promised to shield her from harm. The night air grew colder, the wind carrying the scent of smoke from some distant camp. She felt the land watching, holding its breath for what was to come. Her own breath caught in her chest as the riders drew to a halt only yards away, their horses pawing at the ground, their eyes filled with hunger for cruelty. The warrior did not move, and in that moment she realized the truth. The promise he had made her was not simply to protect her body, but to defend the very dignity that had been stolen from her. Still, the danger loomed heavy, pressing against them both. The men shifted in their saddles, their hands hovering near their weapons. The woman trembled, torn between terror and trust, as the silence stretched into something unbearable. She did not know who would strike first, or what the night would demand of them. All she knew was that her fate was bound to the warrior at her side, and that the story unfolding in the dark was only just beginning. The horses stood restless, their hooves kicking up the dirt as the riders tightened their circle. The woman's chest rose and fell in sharp bursts, her body tense as if the ground beneath her might give way. She could feel the weight of their stares, cold and unrelenting, the same eyes that had once watched her crumble to the ground. Now they lingered on her with the same cruel amusement, as if they already believed she belonged to them again. Her stomach twisted at the thought, but the Apache's stillness beside her gave her something to hold on to. The leader of the riders leaned forward in his saddle, his grin stretching wide in the fading light. His words came sharp, dripping with arrogance, but the woman's ears burned too much to follow every detail. The tone alone was enough. He mocked her weakness, mocked the warrior who dared to stand in their way, as though neither of them had any chance against men who thought themselves untouchable. His companions chuckled, but the sound was uneasy, glancing at the Apache with something more than mockery in their eyes. The warrior remained silent, his jaw set, his hand brushing lightly against the knife at his side. He did not reach for it yet, but the message was clear, he was ready. The woman wondered what gave him such strength, how he could face down more than half a dozen men without a flicker of fear. She wanted to borrow even a fraction of that courage, to believe that she was more than the broken figure they had once left in the dust. The riders shifted, debating among themselves whether to strike or simply take what they wanted. Their words carried greed, impatience, and the hunger for control. The Apache listened, his eyes steady, and for a fleeting moment she thought she saw something flicker across his face, not fear, but calculation. He was weighing them, testing the ground, searching for the weakness they thought they didn't have. She realized then that his silence was not empty. It was strategy, a patience born from a life that demanded he outthink as well as outfight. But the danger was not only in front of them. The woman felt the wilderness itself pressing in, as if the land was holding secrets of its own. Coyotes called again from the distance, their cries echoing through the dark. The air smelled of dust and sage, sharp and dry, and the night seemed to wait. She could not tell if the land was an enemy or an ally, only that it was as much a player in this struggle as any man on horseback. Her thoughts drifted briefly to the people she had left behind, the small settlement that had once been her cage. She had run from that place not just to escape the cruelty of these men, but to find something better. A freedom she had only ever glimpsed in dreams. She had believed the world beyond those fences would be kinder, but it had met her with harshness she had not been prepared for. Now she wondered if she was cursed to always fall back into the same chains, no matter how far she ran. The Apache's presence pushed those thoughts aside. She could feel his arm brush against hers, steady and strong, and though he said nothing, it was as if he told her to keep standing. She clung to that quiet reassurance, because without it, the fear might have swallowed her whole. The riders edged closer. One of them laughed and spat into the dirt, his eyes flicking from her to the warrior, daring him to react. Another shifted his rifle, letting the barrel gleam in the fading light as if to remind them both of the power he carried. The woman's breath caught in her throat, and her knees nearly buckled, but the Apache's hand steadied her once more. And then, unexpectedly, one rider spoke softer than the rest. His voice lacked the same cruelty, and for a moment, she thought she heard doubt in it. He questioned the need for this chase, wondered aloud whether the woman was worth the trouble. The others snarled at him, mocking his hesitation, but the seed of discord was there. She caught it in his glance toward her, something uncertain, maybe even pity. It wasn't enough to change anything yet, but it gave her a sliver of hope. Perhaps not every man in that circle was blind to their cruelty. The Apache must have noticed it too. His gaze flicked briefly toward the hesitant rider, as though marking him apart from the rest. She didn't understand the silent exchange, but it stirred something in her. The warrior was not just facing a crowd of enemies. He was reading them, learning where their cracks lay, preparing for what was to come. Still, the tension did not ease. The leader barked again, his words sharper now, filled with impatience. He wanted her back, and he wanted it without delay. The Apache shifted then, only slightly, but it was enough to make every rider tighten their grip on reins and weapons. The woman's pulse quickened, her breath shallow. She thought violence might erupt right there, but the moment passed, stretched thin like a rope that threatened to snap. The night deepened. Stars flickered above, but their beauty was lost in the weight of danger. Every sound, every creak of leather, every snort of a horse pressed on her nerves until she thought she might scream. Yet the Apache never faltered. His calm was a shield, and though she could not see inside his thoughts, she trusted them more than her own. Somewhere in the distance, a faint glow lit the horizon, the suggestion of fire from another camp. The riders noticed it too, glancing toward it with unease. Perhaps it was other travelers, perhaps allies, or perhaps strangers who might bear witness to what unfolded here. The woman saw an opportunity in their hesitation, but she dared not speak it. Any word from her lips might shatter the fragile hold the Apache had on this moment. The hesitant rider spoke again, this time firmer, warning the leader that time was slipping, that others might come upon them soon. The leader snarled in reply, but his confidence had cracked. The Apache watched, and the woman felt his arm shift, almost as if he was preparing to move. She did not know whether he planned to fight, to flee, or to outwit them all, but the decision hung in the air like a storm cloud ready to break. Her own thoughts tangled. She feared the violence that might spill, but she also feared what would happen if she was dragged back. Her mind replayed the humiliation, the way her spirit had been crushed under their laughter. She could not bear to live that way again. And so, for the first time, she felt her fear twist into something sharper. She wanted to fight too, even if her body was weak, even if her strength was not like theirs. The warrior had promised to protect her, but perhaps she could find a way to protect herself as well. The night pressed closer. The riders muttered among themselves, the leader's authority fraying as doubt spread. The Apache stood like a statue of resolve, unshaken, waiting for the moment when the choice would be forced upon them. The woman's heart pounded, knowing that no matter what happened next, it would change everything. The silence stretched, fragile and heavy, until the leader raised his hand in a signal that made her breath catch. The horses shifted, the men tightened their grips, and the moment of stillness was about to shatter. She braced herself, clinging to the only truth she knew, that the warrior beside her had promised she would not face this alone. The promise hung in the air, stronger than any weapon, as the night prepared to explode into whatever fate it carried. And in that breath before the storm, the land itself seemed to lean closer, waiting to see what would come of the battle between cruelty and the vow of protection. The rider's hand hung in the air, and for a single breath, the world seemed to stop. The woman could hear nothing but the pounding of her own heart, each beat like a drum echoing in her ears. Even the night itself seemed to wait, the stars frozen above, the wind caught in the grass, as if everything hung on the signal that hovered between peace and chaos. The Apache did not flinch. His shoulders squared, his eyes locked on the riders before him, and his grip at her arm steadied her against the tremor in her legs. Then the leader's hand dropped. The riders urged their horses forward, circling tighter, their laughter rough and sharp as the ring closed around them. Dust rose from the pounding hooves, choking the air and blurring the edges of the night. The woman tried to hold her ground, but fear threatened to drag her back into the dirt where she had begun. She pressed closer to the Apache, searching for courage in his unshaken presence. The leader barked a command, his voice slicing through the dust. Two of the riders leaned low in their saddles, ready to seize her from where she stood. Her breath caught, and she stumbled back, but the Apache shifted, placing his body squarely between her and the oncoming men. His knife glinted in the starlight, not raised in reckless fury but held with calm certainty. He did not lash out, not yet. He waited, as though every second of patience was a weapon sharper than steel. The horses reared, sensing the tension. The men cursed, pulling their mounts back for a moment, and the circle rippled with unease. The Apache's silence pressed on them like a weight, daring them to make the first mistake. The woman clung to that silence too, though her body trembled with the urge to cry out. Every instinct screamed for her to run, but her legs still remembered the sting of her last fall. She knew she could not outpace them. Her only hope was the man who had promised she would not be taken again. The hesitant rider's voice cut through the dark, low, and uncertain. He urged the others to leave, to call it finished before blood spilled. His words carried reason, but reason had little place here. The leader snapped back, his pride too heavy to allow retreat. The woman watched the exchange with a fragile hope, wondering if the crack among them might widen enough to save her. But the leader's rage burned hotter than doubt, and his eyes locked on her with a hunger that turned her stomach. The Apache shifted again, his free hand brushing lightly against her shoulder, urging her to step back. She obeyed, though her knees wobbled beneath her, her breath shallow. He moved forward, just one step, and in that step was the quiet power of a man unwilling to bend. The riders hissed among themselves, their circle faltering. None of them wanted to be the first to test him. The woman realized with sudden clarity that he was not only standing for her, he was standing against everything they believed, that cruelty was strength, that fear ruled, that dignity could be stolen without consequence. But the balance could not hold forever. The leader, red with fury, spurred his horse forward. The animal charged, hooves pounding the dirt, and the woman's cry tore from her throat before she could stop it. The Apache moved with speed that startled even her fear. His knife flashed upward, not to kill, but to turn the horse aside. The animal reared, screaming into the night, throwing its rider off balance. Dust swallowed them both, and for a moment chaos exploded. The other riders surged forward, shouting curses, their rifles swinging down. The woman stumbled back, choking on dust, her vision blurred. Shapes lunged and shifted in the haze, the clang of steel meeting steel, the crack of reins snapping. Her body screamed to flee, but her heart could not abandon the man who had lifted her from the dirt. She pressed against the jagged rocks at the edge of the trail, searching for safety, but her eyes stayed fixed on the struggle unfolding. The hesitant rider hung back, his face twisted with indecision. His companions shouted at him, urging him forward, but he did not move. The woman caught his glance again, a flicker of something human in the storm of cruelty. She clung to it, wondering if fate had hidden an ally in the circle of her enemies. The Apache fought with the precision of someone who had been forged in survival. He moved like the land itself, unpredictable, unyielding, relentless. His knife struck with speed, not wild but controlled, cutting through the chaos to keep them at bay. Each time a rider pushed forward, he forced them back, his body a wall between her and danger. Yet she could see the strain, the odds heavy against him. There were too many, their weapons too many, their numbers too thick. Her hands shook as she reached to the ground, her fingers brushing against a loose stone. It was heavy, rough in her palm, but it was all she had. She clenched it tight, her heart pounding as she realized that perhaps she could not stand back forever. She was no warrior, but she was no longer willing to be only a victim either. She waited, breathless, watching for the moment when fear might give way to action. The dust began to settle, and the circle wavered. The leader pulled himself upright again, rage twisting his face as he spat curses at the Apache. He raised his weapon, and the woman's scream lodged in her throat. Time seemed to slow, the night holding its breath once more, and the world narrowed to that single instant. The Apache's eyes locked on the leader, his body coiled with readiness, while the others shifted uneasily, torn between pride and the growing weight of fear. The hesitant rider's voice rose again, louder this time, demanding they stop. His tone carried more than doubt, now it carried defiance. The leader roared back, his pride too deep to hear reason, but the crack had widened. The circle no longer felt whole. The woman saw it, and so did the Apache. It was a chance, a thread of hope, though thinner than a strand of hair. The woman's grip tightened on the stone, her knuckles white, her breath shallow. She knew the moment was coming, the moment when everything would break. The leader's weapon gleamed under the stars, his rage boiling over, and the Apache's stance tightened, ready to strike with all he had. The riders shifted, some leaning forward, others pulling back, the fragile unity between them unraveling by the second. The night pressed close, heavy with tension. The coyote's cries rose again, sharper, as if echoing the storm about to fall. The woman's pulse hammered in her ears, and she felt her whole body trembling. Yet she held her ground, her eyes fixed on the man who had promised to shield her. She did not know what the next breath would bring: blood, escape, betrayal, or salvation. But she knew the moment of truth had arrived. The leader's arm rose, the Apache's knife gleamed, and the world seemed to hang on the edge of the blade. The woman gripped her stone tighter, every muscle in her body ready to break. The night had carried them here, to the brink, and the next heartbeat would decide everything. The leader's arm lifted high, his weapon catching the faint glimmer of starlight, and for a single breath, the world seemed suspended. The Apache stood coiled like a spring, knife ready, his eyes never leaving the man before him. The woman's grip tightened on the stone in her hand until her knuckles turned white. She had never known silence so sharp, silence that felt like the whole earth was holding back, waiting for the moment to shatter. The strike came fast, the leader lunging forward with all the force of rage behind him. The Apache moved just as swiftly, his blade flashing, his body turning with practiced precision. The clash was sudden, violent, and the sound of steel meeting steel rang into the night. Horses reared, riders cursed, and the woman felt her heart leap into her throat. She thought for a moment it was the end, that no man could stand against such odds, but the Apache did not falter. With a surge of strength, he forced the leader back, his knife cutting the air between them. Dust rose, choking the breath from their lungs, but still the fight raged. The woman, trembling but determined, hurled her stone. It struck one of the riders square in the chest, not enough to wound but enough to distract. The man cursed, his horse stumbling, and in that small break she felt something awaken within her. She was no longer only the victim lying in the dirt. The hesitant rider finally broke from the circle. He urged his horse back, shouting that this madness had gone far enough. His voice carried across the chaos, raw with conviction, and for the first time the leader faltered. The others hesitated too, their unity fractured, and in that pause the Apache pressed forward. His knife never struck to kill, only to defend, but his will was unshakable. The men who had once laughed at her weakness now found themselves shaken by one man's resolve. The fight did not last much longer. The leader, battered by dust and failure, realized his power was slipping. He spat into the dirt, his pride bleeding through clenched teeth, and ordered his men to fall back. Some obeyed quickly, glad for an excuse to escape, while others lingered with frustration burning in their eyes. But the spell of their cruelty was broken. With a final curse, the leader wheeled his horse and retreated into the dark, his men following, their silhouettes fading into the night until only the dust remained. Silence fell again, thick and heavy. The woman's legs finally gave way, and she dropped to the ground, her breath shaking as tears spilled freely down her face. She had thought she would never see the moment when those men turned their backs, when she would no longer be a prize to be taken. The Apache stood above her, his chest rising with steady breaths, his knife lowered but still in hand. He scanned the horizon until he was sure the threat had passed. Only then did he crouch beside her, his hand gentle as it brushed her shoulder. "You are safe," he said, his voice low but certain. The words broke what was left of her restraint, and she sobbed into her hands, the weight of fear spilling out of her at last. He did not move away. He stayed beside her until her breathing slowed, until her tears ran dry and she could lift her head again. The hesitant rider lingered at the edge of the trail, his horse shifting beneath him. His face was drawn, torn between shame and relief. He met her eyes only once, and in that look she saw regret for what had been done, for the part he had played in it, even in silence. Without a word, he turned and rode after the others, swallowed by the night. She wondered if he would ever find peace with himself, or if his silence would haunt him forever. The stars spread wide above, cold and clear, as the land slowly returned to stillness. The woman leaned into the Apache, her body weak but her heart stronger than it had been in years. She realized then that his promise had not been empty. He had stood against men who believed they could take whatever they wanted, and he had held true. More than that, he had given her back something she thought she had lost forever, her dignity. The days that followed were a blur of quiet healing. He led her through the wild country, guiding her with patience, showing her water hidden in dry riverbeds, shelter beneath cliffs, and paths that only his people knew. She learned his silence was not emptiness but depth. When he spoke, his words were few, but they carried weight. He told her of the land, of the strength it gave to those who respected it. He spoke of his people, of struggles endured and promises kept. She listened, finding comfort in the rhythm of his voice, in the knowledge that she was no longer drifting alone. Slowly, her spirit began to mend. The bruises faded, the cuts healed, but it was the scars inside that took longer. She carried memories of humiliation like shadows, but each step beside him reminded her that shadows could not claim the light forever. She began to see herself differently, not as someone broken, but as someone who had risen again. She had fallen, yes, but she had also stood back up, with his hand steadying her along the way. There were moments of fear still, moments when the sound of hooves in the distance would send her heart racing. But the Apache was always there, watchful, patient, unyielding. His presence was a constant reminder that not all strength was cruel, that not all power was meant to break. Some strength was born to protect, to lift up rather than cast down. As the weeks passed, she found herself asking questions she had once buried deep. What kind of life did she want now, free of chains? Could she build something new, or would she always carry the weight of the past? The land gave her no easy answers, but it gave her space to breathe, to think, to hope. And hope, she realized, was more powerful than fear. One evening, as the sun sank behind the cliffs, painting the sky in fire, she turned to him. Her voice was quiet but steady. "Why did you help me?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment, the fading light reflected in his dark eyes. Then he spoke, his words simple but filled with meaning. "Because no one deserves to be left in the dust." Her throat tightened at his answer, and she knew there was truth in it. He had not lifted her because of who she was, but because of who he was. A man of the land, bound by honor, carrying strength not as a weapon for cruelty, but as a shield for those who could not stand alone. That truth settled deep inside her, becoming part of her own strength. The story of her fall and rise would remain with her always, not as a chain but as a reminder. She had been beaten, humiliated, left to believe she was nothing. But she had also been lifted, protected, given back the chance to see herself as more than a victim. She would never forget the night the dust rose, when the promise of one man turned the tide of her fate. As the stars emerged above them, she felt a calm she had not known in years. The land stretched wide, filled with danger and uncertainty, but also with freedom and possibility. She knew the road ahead would not be easy. There would always be those who sought to break others, who believed cruelty was power. But she also knew she would never face that road alone. The Apache walked beside her, silent but steady, his presence a vow without end. She had found not only safety but a new beginning, one written in the language of survival, dignity, and hope. And as the night wrapped around them, she understood the lesson the land had been trying to teach her all along, that even in the harshest of places, there could be strength in kindness, courage in silence, and light rising from the darkest of dust.